Hello, everyone. We're almost at the end of the symposium, but for the second to last day, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Hans Gutbrod to deliver a talk on reconciling visions of the past in theory and in practice. Dr. Gutbrod is an associate professor at Ilia State University in Tbilisi, Georgia, and has done extensive research and analysis in the Caucasus region since 1999. Under his affiliation with the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University, Dr. Gutbrod's primary interest is developing the concept of an ethics of political commemoration as a framework for making memory politics more constructive and sustainable. I will now give the floor to Dr. Gutbrod. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for joining for the talk today. And let me kind of put on the screen here, 1 second. And here again, you see the title, you see my Twitter handle below and my affiliation at Ilia State University in Tbilisi. And here, the historian Margaret Macmillan, mostly based at Oxford, has made the point that history in a particular way has a strong role, has the role of a kind of arbiter, and has taken on that role, especially as secularization in the way that we look at the world. I'm not talking about some of its political mobilizations. As secularization has become stronger. And as she says, this is kind of, the history takes on the role of showing us good and evil. She also says it's our authority. It can vindicate us and judge us and damn those who oppose us. Heightened, this process is heightened maybe by the failure, if you will, or the dimming of the hope of the transition paradigm. Stephen Holmes and Ivan Krastev have written this interesting book that many of you might have seen, The Light That Failed, where they said there was a kind of very optimistic transition narrative in the early 90s. You do a couple of things, you get some reforms in place, somehow you try and make it into some kind of multilateral thing, the EU or some other kind of conglomeration like this, and then ultimately a lot of people will be middle class, and there's going to be a degree of political satisfaction there. And Holmes and Krastev has pointed out that this light has dimmed, so there is less of a teleology, less of a look out into the future, you could say, and then in that context, the past becomes more important. This is also the contention of the report that you see here on the right, the State of the Region report, Constructions and Instrumentalizations of the Past. This one's for free. If you don't know it, I can recommend it very, very highly. I will share I've done a small book review. You can just pull it down from the web. There's great summary chapters on everything essentially from the Baltics down to Turkey. But when you look at all of this, the discussions, it turns out that discussion is pretty fragmented. And that's even the case for Margaret Macmillan's book. Here on the page before, when you look at it, you recognize a lot of faces from Tony Blair, Stalin, Osama bin Laden, Gandhi, but it tends to be snapshots rather than a kind of structured discussion. And if you look how do we look for information today? Well, often we just do what I've done here. You go and type in and you go for a kind of expedition and you look for ethical framework for, and when I was looking here, this was Bing for history. You find for AI, charities, accountants. When you look on Google, you'll find for the nursing professions. There's very, very little, except for one great article by a person based at the University of Chicago who'd written something on the ethics of commemoration, but there's very little really on a kind of as a structured approach. And instead, where this seems trapped a little bit, that discussion, which is often a very contentious discussion, as you may know from your own contexts. And you can talk about, I was just at a book presentation, it's getting blurred, just at a book presentation on Germany, from an Israeli sociologist, Nathan Snyder, looking at some of the Israeli post-colonial debates. There are similar debates in France. Of course, these are very, very important debates as relates to Russia or kind of the countries around it. But there are really two ways that people often look at this. They look at history as a practice. Timothy Snyder has written a great article, collective versus kind of causal interpretations of history. And then we have, on the other hand, this kind of memory studies, which in its own way is also a little bit self-enclosed, but is more concerned with this question of legitimacy in politics. And there's a degree of overlap, but there's also misunderstandings because those are really rather different approaches. And what will suggest today, and what I'm suggesting right now, is that we should actually take the lens of ethics to this. Because as, for example, Nathan Snyder, the book that I was just showing to you, as he argues, commemoration also has its limits. But looking at things through a historical or sociological lens isn't necessarily very instructive on limits. And ethics, in some ways, is the balancing and the kind of looking at merit, but also looking at restraint. And if I want to show the full proportions of that, and forgive if I go maybe a bit too theoretical for some, but maybe others may enjoy just what the kind of touchstones here are, and may find that useful. This is maybe a better way even of showing the proportions of what I'm trying to suggest, this ethics of political commemoration, where we have, if you will, on the left, people that look at history as a practice. This is one of the forefathers of this, is Giambattista Vico. Snyder mentions him in this one article as well, but Isaiah Berlin is maybe the main figure who has traced this out. An emphasis on method and causality. And then on the right, we have questions about memory and legitimacy, which is Voltaire. Voltaire, who wants to use history to build foundations, whereas Vico says, well, it's all a bit more complicated. You know, it's multi-causal. Things run into each other, and there are different ways of looking at this. But on the right, again, ideas of community, imagination, and kind of really trying a kind of, a founding project. And my argument, again, is that based on this ethics, on an ethics that's broadly oriented on ideas of mutual recognition, respect, and fairness, and with an orientation towards future peace, we can help bring some order to these debates. Now, I should talk briefly about the boundaries. I'll make that very brief. But the boundaries of political commemoration, this is something that a slide that my colleague David Wood, who I've done some of this work with also, has kind of worked through. There are things that are included and there are things that are not included when we talk about political commemoration. Now, there are clearly things that you're familiar with, ways of signifying importance, memorial days. And I was just in June, I was at a day of commemorating the victims of Stalinism or repression, as it's called more broadly in Armenia. Awards, we'll talk a little bit about that. Monuments, which is a very big debate in many contexts, in Bristol, in the UK, and of course in the United States as well, but also Stalin's monument in Georgia, where I'm normally based. And then there's ways in which we find distances, street names, and I'll show you an example of this. And then there are material actions that could be lustration laws or positive discrimination. And then there's context where we have laws, norms, and their maintenance. And then there's something that I think is very different, which is personal remembrance and artistic expression. So in a class that I teach at a German university, students sometimes come back and show, oh, look, this is how the names of people were listed from the Second World War. Now, Germany, very rightly, overwhelming consensus, takes a huge distance from the Second World War, but some of the ways in which the names of soldiers are listed, who even for the Second World War, there's sometimes you go a little bit, what do we think about that? But then at the same time, those are things that are often in churches, and those are the immediate neighbors that are our family members that are being remembered. This is about personal remembrance rather than about making a political statement. And those things are not really immediately the ones that we're looking at here, at least from my point of view. Now, what's important here is what I'm suggesting we bring into this discussion. In order to transcend the current status of being inchoate, this is one of Isaiah Berlin's favorite words, or you could say pre-paradigmatic. In a situation where there's a kind of chaos and people use relatively simple words, or as Gabriel Garcia Marquez said at some point, where things were so new that people needed to point to them because they had not yet the words. In the first paragraph of 100 Years of Solitude. And this is how often ethical debates on commemoration seem to run. And the framework that we're bringing in is a framework of just war theory. Many of you said you're familiar with it. I've written a short piece summarizing recently, which I'm also happy to share, that if you look at the big wars of the last 25 years, of the last quarter century, a lot of the misgivings people have about them can be expressed incredibly well with a just war theory. So, for example, people think that the Iraq war, by most standards, it had a flimsy cause, which turned out to be false. Let's look at kind of the Afghanistan war just going down on jus ad bellum. You say, well, maybe in the beginning it had the plausible intention as well after eliminating the kind of going after Al-Qaeda's base, which was plausible intention, securing Afghanistan, maybe helping the rights of women and the Hazara, but it had very low chances of success, relatively, or a reasonable chance of success at the level of proportional effort. So this is really quite a powerful framework. And this is important for my argument, because if that's true, that this is a powerful framework, then the idea of porting that becomes more plausible. We can go into this a little bit later if you're interested. Again, I've written an article, again, trying to highlight that in 1,500 words. But I think it's a key in this context. I've also felt that if you look at the Karabakh War, very contentious, maybe some of you looked at that in more detail. This is how I kind of got onto that in some ways, that the complexity of that war, it's easier to make sense of that. That's the article there in the bottom right. And yes, this is a kind of originally Catholic tradition, but arguably there are a lot of parallels in a lot of other cultures, because the overarching idea is a resort to force is only appropriate if, as a result, you might have a better peace. And this roughly is the idea of an ethics of political commemoration as well, mobilizing the past and centering that for political purposes. Remember what Margaret Macmillan said: to vindicate, to judge, to damn. So it's not about private commemoration, but if it's really making a political statement, I think the most plausible context is if you make the argument, this helps to bring a better future about, and helps to move away from a past that we want to leave behind. And the suggestion is that in parallel to the jus ad bellum, the consideration, should we actually mobilize, so to speak, we have a jus ad memoriam, and then the jus in memoria, also about the particular levels of restraint. And these are adapted and synthesized in a way. In some ways, those things come straight away: right intention, legitimate authority, from the just war tradition. And in other cases, they're synthesized a little more from public debate on some of these issues. Now, let me walk you through that. So, should we commemorate in the first place? And then we have the criteria, some of which you'll have seen as part of the just war tradition, which is intention, authority, reasonable chance of success, and just cause. Now, I think it's very important really to focus here on the intention. Often people go about the justness of the cause, in the way that kind of young history students, or students that feel that their story requires affirmation. You could say even the discipline of history early on, 19th century, was about kind of, finding that one resistance hero who in Europe, kind of Northern Europe, who resisted the Romans. Yeah, because that was an important thing. You needed to find someone 2,000 years ago who resisted the Romans. So a lot of that ends up being affirmative of the justness of the cause. But I think that one of the key steps here is to focus really on the motives, or rather the intention. And Jay Winter, who's a historian who's written about this, has put it that way. It's not the act of remembrance itself that can be problematic, that's so problematic, but really what the intentions are with which that's being driven forward. Now, one example that I like highlighting for positive reasons, and yes, I'm in some ways have also been connected to Carnegie before, because an organization I used to run, the Caucasus Research Resource Centers, was funded by Carnegie. But I happened on this through another path, was the Aurora Prize. The Aurora Prize, which is a prize given, started by Armenians as a way of putting a positive message out there. And the intention here of the Aurora Prize was to recognize saviors today, or as one of the founders put it, Nubar Afeyan said, he said, I cannot personally thank anymore the people that saved my grandparents in Lebanon, or in Syria, in this terrible context then during the genocide. But he said, I can thank people today who risk their lives, who dedicate their lives to saving others. And here comes, if you will, a very positive intention, which is about making the contemporary context, helping the saviors today. And one example, one very good example of this is maybe Tom Catena. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He's a doctor working in the Nubian mountains. He at some point was the only doctor in kind of a context of civil war. At some point, I think was the only doctor for 500,000 people working there for 10 years, and in the most basic circumstances, saying, "I'm a Catholic." Said, I'm a Christian. That's what Tom Catena said. I'm a Christian. My place as a Christian is where I'm needed most. And the prize money is to help him do more of this work. So this is the recognition was in Armenia, yeah, but the work doesn't necessarily have to be connected to the contemporary Armenian issues. And I think that's a remarkable example, again, of how you drive that forward. And we can discuss that in more detail later. The second criterion that really seems important is the question of legitimate authority. We talk about that in the context of war, and the original idea, you needed to be a sovereign, because otherwise, if you start war, well, you should be able to stop it. Yeah, if it's just militias, there's no end to that. So in the past, there was an emphasis on authority. In the contemporary present, people put much more emphasis on legitimacy. So one of the criticisms one could make of Vladimir Putin, say, well, one of the many criticisms, and I've made that in an article, is if you're not even allowed to say the word war, you cannot really claim that you have a lot of internal domestic legitimacy for what you're doing, because people cannot actually discuss. In the context of commemoration, it means something a little bit different, because typically politicians try and use history to charge their own authority. Yeah, and it's kind of gets mobilized in order to represent oneself in a lineage. And I think challenging that and also asking, how do you move beyond that? Well, that's one reason why in some systems we have presidential systems in which the president tackles these very, very, very important questions that at the same time are hard to tackle while you're in the midst of politics. And I think it's also, if you talk about legitimate authority, why, of course, you can make the argument that people that are contemporarily marginalized, seriously marginalized, should also be part of rethinking how we do commemoration, even if they at the time might not have been in the country because they had not yet immigrated. Because it is about questions often of marginalization that we negotiate, and what does it mean to be part of a collective. How did the Armenian Aurora Prize do it? Well, one way they found was, you will recognize some of those faces, George Clooney in there, which was, of course, a great way of getting attention as well. If I maybe one of the first things that I noticed on my social media feed many years ago was, oh, George Clooney's in Armenia. And then people ended up getting interested in, of course, what was going on. But look at these people. This is a prize funded by Armenians or diaspora Armenians. And they had decided that in order to give it legitimacy as this venture, they wanted a broad representation. So you had Benjamin Ferenc, who was one of the prosecutors in Nuremberg, in the Nuremberg trials. You have Bernard Kouchner, founder of the Médecins Sans Frontières, Shirin Ebadi, Iran's first female judge, So you have broad representation and really, you could say, legitimate authority for making that determination of how to do that. And of course, we can think about that in other contexts as well, what it means to be legitimate when it comes to questions of these decisions. You could just say very quickly on Babin Yar, for example, very contentious topic. Of course, one of the concerns, precisely Babin Yar, the Holocaust Memorial Center, one of the concerns was that those were people that were directly linked to Vladimir Putin on the funding side, and that this wasn't really a way of really telling a legitimate story in the Ukrainian context. Another thing that we maybe should pay attention to is this question of reasonable chances of success. Now, this gives a strong role. Do we have a chance of success with this style of commemoration? So this gives a role to empirical research. What I used to do, this is some of my research of my colleagues. What are the phrasings that people in South Ossetia, for example, in Georgia and in Georgia itself could accept? And this was one of the criticisms, for example, of Babin Yar Memorial Park, looking at the watch here, to make sure I don't get too much into details, but that they wanted to do a kind of immersive experience of what it meant, what it was like to be at that site. And one of the criticisms is these deep things of commemoration are maybe not fields of experimentation, because one can have different views on this, but at least a reasonable chance of success, I think, matters. And then there's more to say on this, but let me just highlight the other point that I think is, to me, is important, which is to de-emphasize a little bit the just cause. Often just cause has been associated in many people's minds along the lines, well, is it a genocide, yes or no? And the Great Hunger in Ireland most likely doesn't really qualify as genocide for many reasons, but it is absolutely something that people may want to commemorate. The Holodomor in Ukraine, technically, by the definition, does not qualify as a genocide because Stalin's representatives were part of the negotiation of the original genocide definition, and they made sure that class is not part of the genocide definition. But does that really matter? Or does it really matter in East Timor whether it's a genocide or not? And my argument is we have these names, and often these strong local names, and I think emphasizing, staying with those is often enough. Or as the Aurora Prize did it, I think very, very well, that they connected. Aurora has a double meaning. I'll get to that in a moment, but they connected that story to this Aurora Madiganyan, who was a single survivor. As the story goes, there were 17 young girls and 16 crosses, and because there were only 16 crosses, she was not crucified and survived. And at the same time, Aurora means dawn, means a new light. Yeah, and so the story is centered not so much on this is how many tens of thousands, millions, etc., perished, but rather here's an individual, and we center that. So this is the concept of use at memoriam and now use in memoria. What are some of the key things? What key thoughts there? 4 particular criteria come to mind. First, there's ways in which these collectives, some of these collectives were created by the atrocities. And as Benedict Anderson, I'm sure you've come across this, has pointed out, in many ways, some of these communities are imagined or forced. I mean, what does it mean to be, apply the Nuremberg laws on whether someone is Jewish? I mean, these are in many ways absurd categories and offensive categories, because it means you're not being treated as an individual. And in a way, the argument you could make, and I think there's an argument that's also been made in Ireland, is that it's important to get out of these collectives. And as Ron Sooney here put it, a historian, is moving away from the nationalist master narratives that portray the other people as perpetrators and their own as victims only. That doesn't mean kind of both sidism, and everything's the same, but really trying to transcend that story. And how did the Aurora Prize do it? If we want to highlight a positive example again, by saying that there's a circle, really. Gratitude in action means surviving, reviving, thriving, and then giving back. And I actually think that's a really great way of putting it, because it also doesn't say straight away from surviving, you have to give back. No, you've got to somehow revive and you have to thrive. And then there's a chance of giving back. And part of that is also exiting circular narratives. I observe that a lot in and we can all observe it on social media, that people get trapped in these particular narrative loops of self-affirmation. And the best quote for this that I found is the Richard Feynman. He's a physicist, and he's talking about natural science, but it's very, very true about people, the way people talk about history as well. That he says the first principle is that you should not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And these nationalist stories are often, if you will, hypotheses that are hungry for confirmation, where you always look for the one bit that actually affirms that story, and kind of challenging that is important. And here on the left is an example of art, of how people try to transcend kind of just this, oh, here's the wall, so these were searchlights in Mexico and in the US, and if they met, you could actually have a conversation, which is, again, getting people out of the bubbles that they're in. Connected to that is what social media gets us to do and conditions us to do. And, you know, I'm part of that as well. I fall into the trap. It's not that I'm kind of speak from kind of an elevated wisdom, but also from self-observation, traps one can fall into, is that people justify their own side with reference to how bad the other side is. And here's an example of, in this particular case, and on the left, an Azerbaijani who spent his time trawling the internet to find an Armenian who happens to be somewhere in the US, who says offensive things about Azerbaijanis, and this then becomes the main focus. And Conor Cruise O'Brien, the writer, also sometime politician in the Republic of Ireland, has made the following point, which I think remains very, very important, especially also in the social media context, that of course we should condemn all violence, but we also have a special duty to condemn violence that's been done, which is committed in our own name. And that was also really important in Ireland to help, I think, move beyond the kind of traps, circular traps that they're in. Okay, I'm in my last kind of 3-4 minutes here. And then this is the word or the criterion that some people find the oddest name, which is the question, how do we ultimately deal with the situation that there's something in which the way that we usually describe things through numbers militates at the same time against the very idea of an atrocity. Does it matter so much how many people were killed in 1989 in Georgia on April 9? And should we compare this to how many were killed in Riga or Baku? Because those are numbers. On the left, you have what exists on Wikipedia, a list of genocides, and then you can toggle it for list in descending order of lowest estimate. So you can do your chart. And there's just something that I think most people find at least odd about the idea that we do a numbers comparison. And and it's also something I struggled with. I'll not talk about it too much, but I spent my the kind of early 20s. I went to the former Yugoslavia a lot. I didn't see terrible things, but in Bosnia. But at some point I was struggling, thinking, how do I write about Srebrenica? You look up the numbers and you go, you're going to write 8,500? So, and my argument is really that there's something that when I synthesize what I see in the debate, it seems to be that the plausible reaction to this is to be precise with locations and dates, to contain things, because it also matters that you contain them. And then at the same time that with numbers, we stay in categories, dozens, thousands, tens of thousands, millions, rather than trying to signal our support by ratcheting up these numbers in themselves. And art, of course, in that plays a great role. On the top, you have an image from the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, where it's kind of the unfathomability, or as Albert Camus said, at some point, at some level of loss, is just a misdrifting through the imagination. One concrete example of this, in order to, and this is what I now still want to show you, I should actually have put that somewhere else, but was this question, this vexed question of street names. Tübingen, Germany, university town, has this challenge as well. And some of those street names, you go, well, okay, yeah, this is a kind of, was a writer who in her late 70s wrote a friendly letter to Adolf Hitler. That's not great. She should not have done that. But there were a lot of other things to her name. Some other names you go, tricky. And here, the mayor, who's an interesting figure, the mayor of this university town, and a lot of the things that we talk about, Hegel, et cetera, in the background, of course, came from Tübingen, so it's had its kind of radiance. They came up with an idea of then saying, instead of replacing the street names, put a knot into the pole so that everyone can see there's some knotted history there, and we kind of follow that up, but not actually take the name down, because the complexity is part of that. Okay, this was one example of application already. We've shown you the Aurora Prize, and I want to make two more points here, and then relate that also to how that connects to you directly. The Aurora Prize, these stars that we put there, they're very, very indicative. I think, I'm hesitating to put it there, but it can help think about these things. It's not that we do a scoring system and say, hey, this is a great way of doing it, but just to illustrate, if you look through these various criteria, the Aurora Prize comes out looking really rather well. Yeah. Will they finally succeed in kind of changing the narrative in Armenia on some things, or making it more optimistic, as making more future oriented, as some of the initiators wanted? Well, let's see. That we don't entirely know. You could also make the argument there should only be 3 stars. Some of my friends in Armenia say, well, there's a lot of rich people. They're probably more on the side of thinking it's 1 or 2 stars. Yeah, but this is the lanes in which we're having the discussions, and can maybe help think about it. You could say that the memory laws, I'm not showing the memory laws in some places, are an example that's rather negative. Oops, sorry, going back here, rather negative, because they often trap people in particular narratives. Another example that I've written about, there's an article out with Ponars, is the Stalin Museum in Georgia. Some of you may know, in Georgia, a country that's broadly aspiring, with a lot of difficulties, aspiring to be a democracy, there is still a museum that celebrates Stalin. And as a Russian friend of mine has said, when he went in, the guide looked at him, trying to make up her mind, what kind of person is this? And decided, yeah, he's Russian, but he's more of a hipster, so he gets the sanitized version of the tour. If you don't look quite hipster-like, it's kind of, you get what a great guy Stalin was. And as Timothy Blauvelt, a really interesting historian, has put it, they try to think about, what do we do with this museum? Because it's a museum that's remembering a mass murderer. And it's right there. And school children go there. And a friend reports that another friend of his was threatened with a knife in close to Gori, and when he refused to drink a toast to Stalin by some 25-year-olds. So it's an issue that matters. And so they try to bring historians together. And then, as Timothy Blauvelt, the historian, says, he felt it was like a committee that was created to create a committee, and cites John Le Carre, who said it was like an animal with 4 back legs. And so the idea of the ethics of political commemoration is, in a way, is to bring the front legs back, because you give a direction and you can go, what would legitimate authority be? It would not be what Saakashvili did, which was to remove the statue of Stalin in the middle of the night, because he didn't dare do it in the beginning. An even more crazy story, at some point, this is a confirmed story, offering during the 2008 war, offering Russian soldiers $50,000 if they would blow up the Stalin statue. Yeah, you need to put it in kind of somewhat pat terms. You need discussion rather than dynamite to solve these issues. And this is kind of the ethics of political commemoration, I think, help think about some of this. And in this, my own view would leave more Stalin than some of my liberal friends in Georgia might be comfortable with, but I think would just juxtapose it in really important ways. So that would be a space in which you have to engage with a problematic history. This also matters this is a slightly different application. What do we do within the Sackler family name? Sackler family, many of you will be aware, have made billions and have donated billions by helping to create the opioid crisis. And this is sort of, this has a very kind of concrete application or discussion there. Should art whitewash itself again, or should it maybe not still retain some kind of tension there? But again, the applications are broader. I looked at a museum, and I'll stop there without getting into these examples. We can talk about it if you're interested. I'm about to publish something on a museum, the Tito Museum in Briuni, on the island of Briuni in Croatia, and on the Armenian commemoration and the Cascade Memorial in Armenia, which is very interesting. So you can apply this to a lot of things. And I think it matters for the following reason. I think without a cogent critique, you end up having an expansive commemoration. First, it anchors maximalist politics. Secondly, and this is my personal observation, I cannot prove it. Yeah, it's just a hunch. But I think it distorts the politics of opposition, because the opposition remains trapped in often ways in a cosmology of heroes, martyrs, traitors. And that's not the way that you can really connect and build a persuasive political case. And this was certainly one of the reasons why I became more interested in these questions. I've done a lot of opinion research, lots and lots and lots of opinion research in Georgia, and in Armenia also, Azerbaijan a little less. And I would often talk to people, also opposition friends, and saying, well, maybe you do X. And in the end, I realized it's not the problem about explaining X to them. It's not what you put into the Excel sheet so much. I felt that there was a problem with the operating system. So it wasn't fixing the formula that would help it. And that ends up favoring oligarchic dominance, I think, in the end, because leveling really and understanding question of legitimacy is, my sense is they struggle with. And it also corrupts academic inquiry, because people think that their task is to somehow show the justness of their cause and do the patriotic work, rather than telling maybe the micro histories and the more complex things. Now, last slide, a little later than I wanted, but so what are some of the policy things that come out of that? Well, some of this I'm trying to do right now, which is apply, not institutionalize necessarily, but at least advocate for this, that this is a cogent framework for critique. And if you're interested, I'll can explain why I think it passes 3 truth tests. The idea is not to force agreement. Yeah, as Hannah Arendt at some point said, invoking another philosopher, said, it's not so much the single truth itself, but the unending conversation about truth. And so that we don't talk past each other. Because if one person talks about the justness of a cause and the other person talks about the reasonable chance of success, the discussion will get even more polarized, because they have the impression that the other side doesn't understand them. And for that reason, we need a multidimensional ethics to say, yes, if you insist on the justness of a cause, that's right, but there are other questions that also should be considered. And with that, also expanding the sphere of legitimate disagreement. It's not about saying everyone should agree about the Aurora Prize or about anything else that I say. If you want to disagree, yes, but here are some of the factors. And a little bit like the just war tradition, it's also not a checklist. Yeah? It's not that you kind of tick that off, but rather, as Michael Walzer said, it's a framework for extending scrutiny and for an imminent critique that helps there. And why do I think it's a huge opportunity for relatively young scholars? Because it's an interesting, I would say that, of course, I think it's a useful framework, but it's an interesting way of looking at museums, and not just at things that are terrible, but how do you look at, let's say, how legitimacy gets represented in other historical museums, in things of deep history or school books. And I do think that often not much necessarily saying, I'm now going to do the analysis of this huge national debate, but going into one particular site as, again, example that Aurora Prize is one example, Tito Museum is another, and going, well, how does that look to us? Yeah. And then it becomes, there are many ways of really doing interesting analyses. One of my argument with Tito was that we live, there's ways in which we live in a time of panoptic legibility. Panoptic meaning you can really almost read almost everything. We can follow what's going on in Ukraine. Of course, we don't see everything, but we see a lot. Yeah, we don't even need to go to a place, and we can read the reviews. But at the same time, that knowledge is incredibly fragmented, and it can be hard to make sense of that. And if you have an ethical framework, then suddenly a lot of these things can fall into place. And as I try to illustrate in this particular case of the Tito Museum, the 97 reviews on TripAdvisor in themselves, they tell a really fascinating story of that museum and the problems of commemorating Josep Tito. And each of those snippets in themselves are just snippets, but taken together, it makes for something interesting. And so again, if you're early career, this is great stuff where you can write 1,000 words, 1,500 words, and where I think a lot of people are interested, because the established debates are a little bit kind of they've run their course. And so you have my Twitter handle in the beginning. If this is something you want to follow up on, I'm also always happy to have a conversation beyond what we have right now. So I've really been quite a bit over time, but we still have time for discussion now.